Have you ever wondered what life was truly like for women over 1,000 years ago? What hidden torments did they endure behind closed doors, in a world so different from our own? Imagine the year 790, at a time of Viking longships, emerging kingdoms, and powerful churches. What unspeakable struggles did women face in their own homes, in an age where their voices were often silenced and their fates decided by others? Number 9. Physical violence and beatings. Imagine a world where the very foundation of a woman's existence could be shaken by a fist, a stick, or a lash, not in a faraway battle but within the supposed sanctuary of her own home. In 790, out across the nascent kingdoms of what we now call Europe, from Anglo-Saxon England to the Frankish Empire, physical violence against women was shockingly prevalent, often tolerated, and sometimes even sanctioned by custom or rudimentary law. This was not merely the occasional outburst of temper, but a systemic pattern of dominance asserted through brute force. A husband's right to correct his wife was deeply embedded in societal norms, a dark shadow lurking in every marriage. Think of a young woman, perhaps barely out of her teens, married off to a man twice her age to secure a land alliance or a family fortune. Her new life was meant to be one of duty and obedience, but it could quickly descend into a nightmare of pain. The very concept of a woman's bodily autonomy was virtually non-existent. She was often seen as property, first of her father, then of her husband. This perception naturally led to the idea that physical discipline was not just acceptable but sometimes even necessary for maintaining order within the household, which was considered the bedrock of society. Chronicles from the era, though scarce in detailing the suffering of ordinary women, sometimes mention cases of wives being beaten or even killed with little recourse for justice. For instance, the early legal codes, such as those from the Salian Franks, hinted fines for harming a free woman, but these fines were often paid to her family, not to the woman herself, underscoring her status as a possession. The underlying message was clear. Damage to property was more readily recognized than injury to a person's dignity or safety. Typical scenario might involve a woman failing to perform a chore to her husband's satisfaction, perhaps letting the fire die, or a meal burn. In a world where survival was precarious and labor was constant, such missteps could be perceived as grave offenses. Her husband, perhaps exhausted from a day in the fields or frustrated by other burdens, might see this as an act of defiance or incompetence. A slap, a punch, or even a beating with a staff could be the swift, brutal punishment. There were no social services to call, no neighbors to intervene without risking their own safety or reputation, and certainly no shelters. The church, while advocating for charity and mercy, often also upheld a patriarchal structure, where the husband was the unquestioned head of the household, mirroring God's dominion over humanity. Some ecclesiastical texts even, regrettably, seem to imply that a husband had a right to administer moderate corporal punishment to his wife to ensure her spiritual and moral rectitude. The injuries sustained from such violence could range from bruises and welts to broken bones, internal bleeding, and even permanent disfigurement. Imagine the terror of living in constant fear, never knowing when the next blow might fall. A woman might carry the marks of her abuse, not just on her body, but deep within her spirit. Constant fear of physical harm could lead to debilitating anxiety, depression, and a complete erosion of self-worth. She would learn to anticipate her husband's moods, to walk on eggshells, to become invisible. Her world would shrink, confined by the walls of her home and the towering presence of her abuser. There was no escape. Running away meant destitution, starvation, and likely a far worse fate in a harsh, unforgiving landscape. Returning to her birth family was often not an option either, as she was no longer their responsibility. Once married, and bringing shame upon her husband's house could reflect poorly on her own kin. Her only hope was often silent endurance, praying for a merciful end to her suffering, or perhaps a miraculous change in her tormentor's heart. The physical scars were merely the visible testament to a deeper, more pervasive violation of her human spirit. Number 8. Forced marriage and betrothal. The concept of love as the primary basis for marriage was a distant, almost alien notion in 790 AD. Instead, marriage was overwhelmingly a strategic alliance, a transaction between families, a way to consolidate land power or wealth. For women, this often meant having absolutely no say in who they would spend their lives with, and in many cases, being forced into unions that were not only loveless, but actively dangerous. This was not a romantic notion of arranged marriage for mutual benefit. It was often a profound violation of a woman's individual agency, a complete denial of her right to choose her own destiny. A young woman, perhaps barely in her teens, might be betrothed from infancy or early childhood. Her father, or her male guardians, would negotiate her future like a piece of property, in a complex game of chess. The potential husband might be significantly older, a widower with many children, or a man with a reputation for brutality. Her wishes, her fears, her feelings were utterly irrelevant in these negotiations. For instance, Anglo-Saxon charters and Frankish capitularies from the period illustrate the meticulous details of land transfers and dowries that accompanied marriages, clearly showing women as the currency in these exchanges, rather than active participants. A daughter's value was often directly tied to the lands or goods she brought to the marriage, or the political connections her family could provide. Imagine the crushing weight of such a fate. A girl might grow up knowing that her future was already sealed, that she would be handed over to a stranger who held absolute authority over her life. She might hear whispers of his cruelty or his coldness, yet be powerless to resist. This was not just a legal or social custom. It was a deeply ingrained form of psychological abuse. The knowledge that her body, her labor, and her very existence were predetermined for someone she did not choose and likely did not even know, was a constant source of dread. The act of forced marriage stripped away any hope of personal happiness or autonomy. Consent of the bride was a mere formality, if it was sought at all. Sometimes, a symbolic consent was obtained by asking if she objected, but the social consequences of refusal were so severe, bringing shame upon her family, risking destitution, or even becoming an outcast, that it was rarely a genuine choice. The psychological impact of being forced into such a union was devastating. A woman might enter marriage with profound anxiety, depression, and a sense of hopelessness. She was expected to perform her wifely duties, including bearing children, without any emotional connection or genuine consent. This could lead to a lifetime of quiet misery, a suppressed existence where her true self was never allowed to flourish. Her role was to be fertile, obedient, and industrious, regardless of her personal feelings or safety. In a society where illegitimacy was a severe stigma and a woman's purity was paramount, remaining unmarried was almost unthinkable, pushing women further into these predetermined unions. The very concept of marital rape was non-existent. A wife was considered her husband's property, and her body was at his disposal. Therefore, forced marriage inherently contained the possibility of lifelong sexual coercion, a violation of her personhood that went beyond mere lack of affection. Tragic irony was that what was considered a societal necessity, the binding of families through marriage, became for countless women a life sentence to a relationship devoid of choice, dignity, and often safety. Her body, her future, her entire being were traded like cattle for the benefit of others, leaving her with no escape and no voice. Number 7. Economic control and deprivation. In 790, a woman's life was inextricably linked to the economic realities of her household. For many women, particularly those in the lower echelons of society, their very survival depended on their husband's goodwill and provision. This created a fertile ground for a pervasive and insidious form of abuse. Economic control and outright deprivation. A husband could, with alarming ease and social acceptance, control every aspect of his wife's material life, denying her basic necessities, restricting her access to resources, and keeping her in a state of utter dependence. Imagine a woman named Æthelflæd, living in a small village, whose entire existence revolves around the daily grind of survival. Her days are filled with arduous labor, grinding grain, spinning wool, tending to livestock, raising children, and maintaining the hearth. Every morsel of food, every scrap of cloth, every piece of firewood is a product of immense effort. Yet, her husband holds the ultimate authority over all resources. If he chooses to be cruel, he can withhold food from her, denying her adequate sustenance while perhaps eating heartily himself. He can refuse her appropriate clothing, leaving her vulnerable to the elements or making her appear disheveled and unworthy in the community's eyes. He might deny her access to basic tools or materials necessary for her work, effectively disabling her ability to contribute, and then blaming her for the lack of output. Historical records, though not explicitly detailing individual cases of deprivation, reveal a societal structure where women had limited property rights. While some women, particularly aristocratic ones, might inherit land or goods, their control over these assets often passed to their husbands upon marriage. The Anglo-Saxon laws, for instance, show a complex system of dower and mourning gift, but these were typically for the woman's provision after her husband's death, or in case of divorce, not for her independent use during the marriage. Any earnings she might acquire from selling her produce, such as eggs or cheese, were almost certainly subject to her husband's control or appropriation. This meant a woman had no independent means to secure her own well-being or escape a terrible situation. She could not buy food, shelter, or assistance without her husband's permission or resources. The psychological toll of such economic control was immense. It created a state of constant vulnerability and anxiety. A woman was perpetually reliant on her abuser, her very survival tied to his capricious decisions. This dependency was reinforced by the social stigma of poverty and the lack of viable alternatives. If she was denied food, she risked starvation. If she was denied warm clothing, she risked illness and death from exposure, especially during harsh winters. If her husband withheld resources for her children, it would amplify her agony, forcing her to endure his cruelty for their sake. This economic bondage effectively trapped women in abusive relationships. There was no going to a local market to sell her crafts if her husband forbade it or took her meager earnings. There was no possibility of saving money to flee, as all resources were under his domain. Furthermore, economic deprivation wasn't just about withholding physical necessities. It was also about withholding the means of production. A husband might deliberately sabotage his wife's ability to contribute to the household's economy, perhaps by selling her tools, restricting her access to raw materials like flax or wool, or forcing her to neglect household duties that would allow her to produce valuable goods. This not only deepened her dependence, but also served to undermine her self-worth, making her feel useless and incapable. Constant threat of destitution, combined with the daily reality of meager rations or inadequate provisions, was a relentless form of abuse that chipped away at a woman's health, spirit, and any flicker of independence she might harbor. Her only hope was often to simply survive, day by brutal day, under the crushing weight of her husband's absolute economic power. Number 6. Emotional and psychological torment. Beyond the visible scars of physical violence and the palpable grip of economic control lay a more insidious and equally destructive form of abuse: emotional and psychological torment. In 790 and this might not have been recognized or named as abuse in the way we understand it today. Yet its impact was profoundly damaging, eroding a woman's self-worth, mental stability, and sense of reality. This type of torment relied on constant criticism, shaming, isolation, threats, and a systematic dismantling of a woman's spirit, leaving her a hollowed-out shell of her former self. Imagine a woman named Hild, who finds herself subjected to a relentless barrage of verbal attacks from her husband. Every action she takes, every word she speaks, every aspect of her being is scrutinized and condemned. Her cooking is never good enough, her weaving too coarse, her children too noisy, her appearance too plain. He might compare her unfavorably to other women, to past wives, or even to mythical figures highlighting her perceived shortcomings and failures. This constant stream of negative reinforcement, designed to chip away at her confidence, leaves her feeling utterly worthless and inadequate. He might belittle her in front of their children or other family members, undermining her authority and dignity within her own household. Such public shaming was particularly effective in a communal society where reputation was everything, further isolating her. The use of threats was another potent weapon in the abuser's arsenal. While physical threats were often implied or carried out, psychological threats could be equally paralyzing. A husband might threaten to send her away, to deprive her children of food, to turn her family against her, or to spread rumors that would ruin her reputation. In an age where a woman's survival depended on her place within a family and community, these threats were terrifyingly effective. They instilled a deep sense of fear and helplessness, forcing her to conform to his demands out of sheer terror of the consequences. The Annals of Ulster or other monastic records, while not focusing on domestic life, sometimes mention powerful men exiling women or accusations of sorcery which could lead to severe punishment, reinforcing the vulnerability of women to powerful male figures. Isolation was a key tactic. While women often had limited social circles due to travel difficulties, an abusive husband might deliberately restrict his wife's contact with her family, friends, or neighbors. He might forbid her from attending gatherings, visiting markets, or participating in communal activities. This physical isolation would be compounded by emotional isolation, as he might undermine any attempts she made to confide in others, perhaps by fabricating stories about her or by subtly warning others away from her. Over time, this could lead to her feeling utterly alone, with no one to turn to, no one to validate her experiences, and no one to offer support or an alternative perspective. Her abuser effectively became her entire world, controlling her perception of reality. Furthermore, psychological torment could involve gaslighting, a term we use today but a phenomenon that has existed for centuries. Her abuser might deny events that clearly happened, twist her words, or make her doubt her own memory and sanity. "You're imagining things," he might say, or "that never happened," even when she clearly remembered it. In a world without external verification, without literacy for most, and without avenues for external support, a woman could easily begin to believe these distortions, leading to profound confusion and a loss of her sense of self. The relentless nature of this emotional abuse chipped away at her spirit, leaving her anxious, depressed, and utterly convinced of her own worthlessness. Her thoughts became her prison, and her abuser the keymaster, dictating her very perception of her own mind. Number 5. Sexual coercion and lack of bodily autonomy. Perhaps one of the most fundamental and deeply violating forms of abuse against women in 790 had stemmed from their profound lack of bodily autonomy, particularly within the confines of marriage. In this era, the concept of a woman owning her own body and having the right to consent or refuse sexual acts was virtually non-existent. A wife was considered legally and socially her husband's property, and her body was deemed to be at his disposal. This societal framework opened the door to widespread sexual coercion, making marital rape not just common but in the eyes of the law and custom, an impossibility to even define as a crime. Imagine a woman married for political or economic reasons who felt no affection or connection to her husband, perhaps even revulsion. Despite her feelings, she was expected to submit to his desires whenever he commanded. There was no concept of consent within marriage. Her refusal would be considered a dereliction of her wifely duty, an act of defiance, and could lead to severe consequences, including physical violence, economic deprivation, or public humiliation. Primary purpose of marriage was often procreation, to secure heirs and continue family lines, and a woman's body was seen as the vessel for this purpose. Therefore, her reproductive capacity was paramount, and her personal comfort or desire secondary, if even considered at all. Early Christian theological texts, while condemning promiscuity outside marriage, often emphasized the procreative duty within it, further solidifying the idea that a wife's body was for her husband's use. The very act of marriage legally transferred control of a woman's sexuality from her father to her husband. She lost the protection of her family in this regard, and gained instead a master. This meant that she had no legal recourse if her husband forced himself upon her. She could not accuse him of rape because within the confines of marriage, such a crime was not recognized. Her husband's right to her body was considered absolute. This pervasive reality meant that many women lived with the constant threat of sexual violation, not from a stranger, but from the man they were legally bound to. This wasn't just a physical act. It was a profound psychological violation, stripping a woman of her dignity, her sense of self, and her control over her own physical being. Consequences of this pervasive lack of bodily autonomy were devastating. For some women, it meant a lifetime of enduring unwanted sexual acts, leading to deep psychological trauma, a profound sense of powerlessness, and a complete detachment from their own bodies. The act of bearing children, which was often a primary expectation, could become intertwined with the trauma of non-consensual acts. A woman might dread the night, the privacy of her bedchamber becoming a place of fear rather than intimacy. There was no one to confide in, no one who would understand, and certainly no legal system that would offer protection. Any attempts to resist could be met with brutal force, further compounding her terror and sense of helplessness. This sexual coercion wasn't just about forced intercourse. It extended to all aspects of a woman's reproductive life. Her husband could dictate the frequency of their sexual encounters, decide whether she breastfed her children, and control family planning to the limited extent it was understood. If she became pregnant, she was expected to carry the child to term, regardless of her health or desire, because the child was his, a testament to his lineage. The complete control exercised by men over women's bodies in 790 AD meant that for many women, their physical existence was not their own, but rather a resource to be used and exploited by their husbands for procreation, pleasure, or the assertion of dominance. This inherent violation was a constant unspoken reality for countless women, leaving deep and lasting wounds that went far beyond what any physical beating could inflict. Number 4. Forced confinement or restriction of movement. While not always involving literal imprisonment, the strategic and often cruel restriction of a woman's movement was a prevalent form of abuse in 790 AD, serving to control her autonomy, limit her social connections, and isolate her from potential sources of support. In a world without modern transportation, where travel was inherently difficult and dangerous, the deliberate denial of even local movement could effectively trap a woman within the confines of her home or immediate property, transforming her dwelling into a personal prison. Imagine a woman living in a modest homestead, perhaps isolated by miles of forest or open land. Her husband might forbid her from visiting her birth family even if they lived in a neighboring village. He might prevent her from attending communal gatherings such as church services, market days, or festive celebrations, where she might interact with other women, share grievances, or simply find solace and connection. This wasn't just about physical confinement. It was about severing her ties to the outside world, making her entirely dependent on him for information, validation, and social interaction. Frankish capitularies and Anglo-Saxon dooms rarely discuss women's mobility, largely because their sphere was assumed to be the domestic. When their movement was restricted, it was often seen as a husband's prerogative, a way to protect his property or reputation. The mechanisms of this abuse could be subtle or overt. He might simply refuse to accompany her on a journey, knowing she couldn't safely travel alone. He might withhold the necessary resources, such as an animal for transport or goods to trade, making any trip impossible. He might explicitly forbid her from leaving the property, threatening severe consequences if she disobeyed. Or in more extreme cases, he might physically bar doors, lock her in a room, or even chain her, though such extreme measures would likely be reserved for those deemed unruly or insane. The underlying goal was always the same: to ensure her absolute obedience by eliminating any opportunity for her to seek help, find solace, or even simply gain an outside perspective that might challenge his control. The psychological impact of such enforced isolation. Cut off from her family and friends, a woman would lose her support network, becoming increasingly vulnerable and dependent on her abuser. She would have no one to confide in, no one to validate her experiences, and no one to offer an alternative reality to the one her abuser constructed for her. This isolation could lead to profound loneliness, anxiety, and depression. She might begin to doubt her own judgment, her perceptions, and her sanity as her abuser became her sole source of information and interaction. This psychological manipulation, born from physical restriction, allowed the abuser to exert absolute control over her mind as well as her body. Furthermore, restriction of movement severely limited a woman's ability to engage in economic activities outside the home, such as selling her produce at market or trading goods. This compounded her economic dependence, making escape even more impossible. The denial of freedom of movement was a constant reminder of her subordinate status and her lack of agency. She was not a free individual, but a possession, whose movements were dictated by the will of her owner. This silent, pervasive control created a cage without bars, a prison built not of stone but of social expectation, fear, and the systematic erosion of her connections to the world beyond her abuser's domain. Her world became impossibly small, and her hope impossibly dim, as the days blurred into an endless cycle of confinement and servitude. Number 3. Social shaming and humiliation in the tightly knit reputation-driven societies of 790. Social shaming and public humiliation served as potent weapons of domestic abuse, capable of destroying a woman's standing, her dignity, and her very means of survival. Unlike physical blows which might heal, or economic deprivation which might be overcome, the wounds inflicted by shaming could be permanent, leaving a woman an outcast, stripped of her identity and any respect within her community. This form of abuse was particularly cruel because it turned the woman's own community against her, transforming potential allies into accusers. Imagine a community where everyone knows everyone else, where whispers travel faster than horses, and where a family's honor is paramount. An abusive husband, perhaps seeking to justify his control or simply to assert dominance, could systematically undermine his wife's reputation. He might spread false rumors about her fidelity, accuse her of being lazy, foolish, or disobedient, or even suggest she was involved in witchcraft or sorcery. These accusations, however baseless, could quickly take root in a superstitious and rumor-prone society. For example, laws from the period often imposed severe penalties for women accused of adultery, even if the accusation was made by a vindictive husband without solid proof. The weight of such an accusation alone could ruin a woman's life. Public shaming rituals, though perhaps not formalized in every community, were powerful tools of control. A husband might drag his wife through the village streets, perhaps after a perceived transgression, to expose her to public scorn. He might strip her of her outer garments or force her to wear something demeaning. He might make her perform humiliating tasks in front of neighbors or subject her to verbal abuse where others could hear. The goal was to break her spirit, to make her feel so ashamed and worthless that she would never dare to defy him again. Community, often fearful of intervening or of being drawn into domestic disputes, might stand by observing her humiliation, which only amplified her isolation and despair. The consequences of social shaming were profound. A woman whose reputation was ruined might find herself ostracized. Neighbors might refuse to interact with her. Tradespeople might refuse to sell her goods, and other women might shun her company. This social isolation further tightened the abuser's grip, as she would have nowhere to turn for support or comfort. Her children might also suffer the stigma, impacting their future prospects for marriage or acceptance. A woman's honor was intricately linked to her family's honor, and if her husband deliberately tarnished hers, he effectively cut her off from her own kin, who might be reluctant to take her back and risk their own standing. Furthermore, shaming could also serve as a precursor to more severe forms of abuse or even violence. If a woman was publicly deemed unruly or disobedient, it might be seen by the community as justification for her husband to exert harsher control, including physical punishment. The psychological toll of living under such a constant cloud of suspicion and humiliation was immense. A woman would live in perpetual fear of judgment, internalizing the shame and believing herself to be truly worthless. Her identity would be stripped away, replaced by the negative image projected by her abuser and reinforced by a silent, complicit community. She was trapped, not just by her husband's power, but by the watchful eyes and condemning whispers of an entire world that offered no escape from her torment. Number 2. Denial of rights and agency. In 790 AD, the fundamental denial of a woman's rights and agency was not merely a consequence of abuse, but a pervasive, systemic form of abuse in itself. Women, almost universally, were considered legal minors throughout their lives, perpetually under the guardianship of a male relative, father, brother, or husband. This meant they had virtually no independent legal standing, no voice in decisions that shaped their lives, and no ability to assert their own will. This profound absence of agency created a vulnerability that made all other forms of abuse possible and often impossible to escape. Imagine a woman who could not own land in her own right, sign contracts, or represent herself in court without male intervention. Even if she inherited property, its management and control would often fall to her husband upon marriage. Anglo-Saxon legal codes, for example, show detailed provisions for male property ownership and inheritance, with women typically inheriting only if there were no male heirs, and even then often with stipulations that limited their independent control. Her economic power was almost always mediated through a man. This meant she could not make independent financial decisions, secure loans, or engage in trade without her husband's permission, binding her inextricably to his economic will. The denial of agency extended to her personal life as well. She had no say in whom she married, as discussed earlier, and divorce, while possible in some regions and at some times, was rare and incredibly difficult for a woman to initiate. If she did manage to separate, she risked losing her children, her property, and her social standing, often becoming destitute. Her testimony in legal matters was often given less weight than a man's, and she might not even be permitted to speak for herself in a dispute requiring a male advocate. This meant that if she was abused, her voice might not be heard, or her claims dismissed as frivolous or untrue. This systematic denial of rights meant a woman was fundamentally disempowered in every aspect of her existence. She could not leave an abusive situation because she had no legal means to do so, no independent resources, and no recognized voice to plead her case. If her husband chose to inflict violence, deprive her economically or emotionally torment her, She had no legal protection, no authority to seek help, and no power to stand up for herself. The law, such as it was, existed largely to protect male property rights and social order, not the individual safety or autonomy of women. The very structure of society reinforced her powerlessness, making her a permanent subordinate. The psychological toll of this utter lack of agency was immense. A woman would grow up knowing that her life was not her own, that her choices were limited or non-existent, and that her will was secondary to that of the men around her. This fostered a deep sense of helplessness, resignation, and a crushing blow to any sense of individual identity. She was not a person with inherent rights, but a functional component of a patriarchal household. Her intelligence, her desires, her contributions were often unrecognized or devalued simply because she was a woman. This systematic disenfranchisement was a pervasive form of abuse that permeated every facet of her life, making her eternally vulnerable and perpetually reliant on the often unpredictable will of others. Her very being was defined by what she could not do rather than what she could, leaving her in a perpetual state of quiet, unacknowledged despair. Number 1. Exploitation of labor and appropriation of earnings. In 790, the vast majority of people, men and women alike, were engaged in strenuous labor to survive. However, for women, this labor often went beyond the demanding necessities of daily life, transforming into a pervasive form of abuse through the systematic exploitation of their work and the appropriation of any goods or earnings they managed to produce. While a woman's labor was essential to the functioning of any household, and indeed to the economy of the era, the denial of her ownership over the fruits of that labor and the expectation of endless uncompensated toil constituted a profound and relentless form of oppression. Imagine the dawn to dusk existence of a woman in a typical household. Her day began before the sun, tending to the fire, preparing meals, and milking animals. She would then spend hours spinning wool into thread, weaving that thread into cloth, and then sewing garments for the entire family. She might churn butter, make cheese, brew ale, cultivate a small garden, and preserve food for the long winter months. She was responsible for fetching water, gathering firewood, and cleaning the dwelling. On top of all this, she bore and raised children, often in quick succession, and cared for the sick and elderly. This was not just a job. It was a non-stop, physically exhausting, and often dangerous existence. The abuse came in the complete appropriation of her output by her husband, who was legally the head of the household and owned all its assets. Any cloth she wove, any food she preserved, any goods she crafted, were not hers to sell or trade independently. If she took eggs or cheese to market, any proceeds would typically revert to her husband's control. She received no direct compensation, no independent wage for her endless efforts. Her labor was simply expected, her contribution taken for granted, and often devalued. While men also toiled, their labor often carried more recognized value and control over the output, particularly in agricultural or martial pursuits. The Salic law, for example, often defined property and inheritance in ways that favored male control and acquisition, with women's contributions implicitly subsumed under the husband's dominion. The exploitation deepened when a husband demanded excessive labor beyond what was necessary for the household's survival, or when he deliberately failed to provide her with adequate tools or resources, making her work even harder and less efficient. He might force her to spin or weave for long hours, then sell the goods without giving her any recognition or access to the profits. He might expect her to care for his elderly parents or extended family members without any help or appreciation, adding to her already overwhelming burden. This constant expectation of endless uncompensated toil, coupled with the complete lack of control over the fruits of her labor, was deeply exploitative. The psychological impact of this constant exploitation was one of profound burnout, resentment, and a crushing sense of powerlessness. A woman's life was defined by ceaseless work, Yet she received no acknowledgement, no reward, and no autonomy over her own productive efforts. Her body was constantly fatigued, her spirit worn down by the endless demands and the knowledge that her efforts primarily benefited others. She might feel like a human draft animal, valued only for her ability to produce and serve. This form of abuse, while perhaps less dramatic than a physical beating, was a slow, grinding erosion of a woman's vitality, her sense of self-worth, and any hope for a life beyond drudgery. Her life was not her own to live, but a resource to be endlessly extracted by the man who legally owned her labor and its every output.